Nearly 2 years of speculation surrounding Robert Mueller's Russia investigation coming to a head today. Attorney General William Barr briefed reporters shortly before the report's release and reiterated that the special counsel found no evidence of criminal collusion. We have Team Fox coverage. Bret Baier, anchor of Special Report, Chris Wallace, Fox News Sunday anchor, and Shannon Bream, anchor of Fox News at Night, are all in D.C. Let's start, though, with Chief Intelligence Correspondent Catherine Herridge. She's been reading all of this as fast as she can, and she digests it so well for us. Catherine.
Well, thank you, Dan, and good afternoon. We've spent a lot of time in the last few hours looking at the issue of obstruction because it was the unanswered question by Special Counsel Robert Mueller. But it's definitely worth dipping into part one, which is on collusion. And in fact, that's the largest part of the Mueller report. It's nearly 200 pages. It has the most redactions because it deals with classified information as well as sources and methods. I just want to note that if you go through the contents of that section, you are not going to find a chapter devoted to this dossier. And the reason I note that is because that was one of the drivers of the 2016 counterintelligence investigation by the FBI, and it was used to secure a surveillance warrant for a Trump campaign aide in October of 2016. And what you see is that there really was not only this information operation by the Russians, but there was a lot of outreach to members of the Trump campaign. And what the special counsel found was, quote, although the investigation established that the Russian government perceived it would benefit from a Trump presidency and worked to secure that outcome, and that the campaign expected it would benefit electorally from information stolen and released through Russian efforts, the investigation did not establish that members of the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated with the Russian government in its election interference activities. And this was an issue that the Attorney General William Barr discussed at length this morning.
We now know that the Russian operatives who perpetrated these schemes did not have the cooperation of President Trump or the Trump campaign, or the knowing assistance of any other American for that matter.
One of the lingering questions is what was the genesis of the investigation and how early did it start in 2016? Fox News asked the Attorney General a question about the next steps he's going to take on that front, but he punted on that question for another day, Dana.
Catherine, the Attorney General started off his press conference this morning talking about the origins of this, which is the Russians trying to interfere in our elections. What do we know about that part now?
Well, one of the interesting things in the Mueller report is this incredible detail and clarity about this Russian ambassador, Sergei Kislyak, and what was really an information and outreach campaign by the Russian government, so authorized by the Russian government, to make contact with members of the Trump campaign, from Mike Flynn, who would ultimately become the National Security Advisor, then Senator Jeff Sessions, who would become Attorney General, as well as others that were in the orbit of the Trump campaign, and then the transition. And what's important is that the Russians understood, based on my reporting, that even the appearance of contact could be very damaging to these individuals, as it was when it came to the recusal of Jeff Sessions and then the ultimate firing of Mike Flynn over that conversation about sanctions in December of 2016. He's kind of, if you will, the Russian ambassador is kind of like the Flat Stanley of this investigation. He's everywhere, and it's really amazing to see it all documented in such a thorough way, Dana.
All right, Catherine Herridge, thank you. I'm sure we'll be back to you as anything else develops this hour. Martha McCallum, she's anchor of The Story, and Bret Baier, Chris Wallace, and Shannon Bream all joining me now. Thank you all for doing this for me and for all of our viewers. Martha, if I could start with you. We've had a couple of hours now to digest this a little bit. As you think about this, what is the main takeaway for you?
Well, you know, I look at what Jerry Nadler is saying, and we're waiting for him to come out. It's very clear, as we've often seen throughout this whole process, that both sides are going to dig through here and find what they want and what they find is supportive of all of this. So, you know, Nadler's going to say that it is clear that the president engaged in obstruction of justice. And that's his takeaway from reading this report, that it is clear that he was partaking in obstruction of justice. And then you look back at the report and the inability of Mueller to be definitive on that, and Barr's assessment that that is not what happened. But, you know, this conversation is not dying down, as you and I talked about earlier this morning. And Nadler, I think, is going to stoke the flames of that as he comes out at 2:30. The big debate in the Democratic Party is going to be how they are going to use this.
Exactly. And Chris Wallace, I did want to ask you, you've covered the stories in D.C. where you can have a sense of how big is it? where do the Democrats go from here? Because do they think that upon the first reading that they have a case for impeachment, or at least they're going to have more hearings, that this is actually not going away?
Look, I'm just guessing at this point because I haven't talked to any Democrats since the report came out. There's no question that they're going to say that this doesn't answer all of their issues, and that they are going to have more hearings, at the very least, with William Barr and with Robert Mueller. I would have to say, reading this report, there's a lot of stuff in here that is damaging to the president, politically embarrassing to the president. He blows very hot at various points in the investigation. He directs various people, his White House counsel, Don McGahn, his former campaign manager, Corey Lewandowski, other people to interfere, to try to stop the Mueller investigation, but it never actually happens. And my guess is that while there will be enough fire here, enough kindling to hold more hearings, I don't see much of a basis here for impeachment, and certainly not enough, because you've had Nancy Pelosi say repeatedly this cannot be a purely partisan investigation. There has to be Republican buy-in. I don't see the kind of damaging new smoking gun information that would get a lot of Republicans to suddenly jump ship and say, you know what, this is so far over the line, we're going to support an impeachment proceeding against the president. Again, politically embarrassing, but in terms, obviously, he's off the hook legally. My guess is in terms of an ultimate disposition, he's off the hook in terms of impeachment as well.
Brett Baer, if I could have them call up the soundbite number 21, because the president had a pre-scheduled event today with Wounded Warriors, but he took a moment to just talk about this whole thing, how it ended. You know, he said no collusion, no obstruction, but he also said this about the future.
I'm having a good day, too. It was called No Collusion, No Obstruction. I'm having it. There never was, by the way, and there never will be. I say it in front of my friends. This should never happen to another president again. This hoax. This should never happen to another president again.
Brett, what do you think will happen going forward about a possible look into the Obama administration and officials that were in charge at the time during that presidential campaign in 2016?
Well, I do think that some of that, a lot of it, will be addressed in the Inspector General's report. Michael Horowitz expected at the end of May, beginning of June. I do know that we heard Attorney General Barr testify that he has a group that is working on it as well, as is Senate Judiciary Chairman Lindsey Graham. So I think it's not, that part of it is not going to be let up. I just want to show people this. This is the two sections of the 440 plus pages. Having gone through this, it is voluminous. The first section is very, very clear that, as the Attorney General said, they did not find conspiring or colluding with the Russians in any way by the Trump campaign, or for that matter, any American. And the line here is pretty stark. I mean, you just look at it, and they say they do not have the evidence to go forward with anything in regards to these connections, despite multiple meetings with the Russians. I will say there are embarrassing parts here because what the press department said or what the president said at the time, and Chris is right. But there's also embarrassing parts in this Mueller report for the news media. There are big whopper stories that are just flat out tossed aside. Remember that BuzzFeed piece that everybody was talking about the president directing Michael Cohen to lie? That's dealt with here. There's a CNN bombshell report that's completely tossed aside. So I think there are media stories here that are also embarrassing as well.
Shannon Bream, I did want to ask you about this. It's very lightly redacted. I worked at the Justice Department for a while. I know redactions are very frustrating to people. I think we have a full screen that we can pull up that shows that they did try to provide the American people as much as they possibly could in this report. But also, to your point earlier, and we'll repeat it here, the Attorney General didn't have to do this at all.
Yeah, there's nothing in the statute or the regulations that require him to do this. I mean, the way that it works is that the attorney or the special counsel has to report to the attorney general on his findings. It simply says that the attorney general has to report on those things to Congress. It could have been 1 page. It could have been the 4-page letter he sent a couple of weeks ago. He wasn't obligated to release this publicly or to Congress. So for people who are worried about his transparency, which he pledged to do, I would hope that many of them would look at this today, and they may still have their concerns on the issue of collusion, but each redaction is spelled out perfectly. But what people were really wanting to dig into was obstruction. So on that volume 2, hundreds of pages there of material that is both flattering and unflattering to the president has been revealed. Barr promised when he was asked by Senator Shaheen on the Hill that he would not withhold information that could be damaging to the president. So it looks like he's made the effort here. We'll see if it's enough for Congress because, as we've talked about, House Judiciary has already approved subpoenas, and they say they'll use them if they need to.
I think that's an important point, and I do want to ask Martha about this idea about cooperation. And if we could pull up soundbite number 15, because I want to have you listen to this. And it's interesting to me that there's these calls about obstruction, and yet the president was actually quite cooperative. Didn't ask for executive privilege on any of the documents, allowed people to go and be interviewed. And then here's this about the special counsel.
The president took no act that in fact deprived the special counsel of the documents and witnesses necessary to complete his investigation. Apart from whether the acts were obstructive, this evidence of non-corrupt motives weighs heavily against any allegation that the president had a corrupt intent to obstruct the investigation.
What do you think of that, Martha?
Well, I think it's interesting. He's using the phrase corrupt intent, which is what they would have to establish to show that there was a criminal element to the efforts to stop things, to slow things down. It's clear the president wanted all of this to go away and that he wanted his people to do whatever they could to make it go away. But Attorney General Barr is saying that essentially when it came down to it, the actual actions that he took never amounted to that. And the fact that he was so forthcoming and the White House was so forthcoming and he allowed his closest counsel, Don McGahn, to speak with them for 30 hours mitigates the things that they found that he said and did that indicated that he wanted it to end. His actions proved that he was being very open in terms of the investigation. And Barr felt, obviously, that offset anything that would have justified corrupt intent.
Right. Chris Wallace, what do you think that the House Judiciary Chairman, Jerry Nadler, might try to accomplish in about 17 minutes? He's going to be giving a press conference.
He's going to try to keep it alive. He will obviously say that first of all, on the question of obstruction, it's very clear when you read the Mueller report that while Bill Barr comes down strongly on the idea that there was no obstruction, Robert Mueller did exactly the opposite. He made it very clear that he could not come to a conclusion that there was no obstruction, and was at pains to say that his report did not exonerate him, while it did not also do anything to, in effect, convict him or charge him with obstruction. I think you'll see Jerry Nadler, 1, try to keep the story alive, 2, say that despite Barr's best efforts, that there are still a lot of open questions here, say despite the fact is that graphic shows that there are relatively few deletions, redactions in particularly the second half, which deals with obstruction, that he's going to want to see the whole report and also to see the underlying evidence for the report. If I could just add one thing, one of the things that's so fascinating about this report is it kind of solves a lot of the mysteries, or solves is probably too strong, but at least gives an opinion on a lot of the mysteries. I'd say 2 people come out of this report fairly well. One of them is James Comey, because almost everything that James Comey said in his very controversial memos about his meetings with the president telling him to go easy on Michael Flynn, all of that, the Mueller report comes down on the side of saying that we believe James Comey. The other person, though, conversely, that it also seems to exonerate to some degree is Carter Page, who was the subject of all of those FISA warrants. It says, we looked at all the information. There was no indication whatsoever that Carter Page conspired or coordinated with the Russians at all in this enterprise. So Comey and Carter Page, 2 very different people.
We'll have to get Kim Strassel of the Wall Street Journal on to talk about that, because she's been on that from the beginning. Martha, Brett, Chris, and Shannon, thank you so much for joining us. We have a lot more ahead on the Mueller report and what it all means. Karl Rove and James Trusty will be joining us with political and legal analysis. That'll be up next.